Welcome back to Lokad. Today, Joannes and I will be discussing computational resources in supply chain. As you will hear, this is much more than simply knowing how to use a computer. Rather, it requires a decent understanding of how it operates best. This is called mechanical sympathy, and as we'll discuss, good mechanical sympathy can translate to better computational resource use and, ultimately, better decisions. Now, as always, if you like what you hear, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and following us on LinkedIn. And with that, I give you today's conversation. So, Joannes, computational resources in supply chain. That's a very large concept. It covers both hardware, comme ça, and software. So, for the purposes of today's conversation, and bear in mind it's a supply chain audience, what's a good working definition of computational resources?
So, computational resources is a general term that covers all the class of hardware that makes up a modern computer nowadays. Those classes are, the separation between the classes is a little bit arbitrary, but only a little bit, meaning that, there is nothing in nature that says there is a class of things we should call CPU, central processing units, a class of other devices that we should call memory and whatnot. So it is a little bit like a co-evolution of the computer design and the role of the market that has been shaping certain niches to have companies that really turn out to have a really, really competitive device for a specific purpose. And that's how there was this co-evolution, and that's how I would say, now 70 years after the introduction of computers, we have now very, I would say, clear classes of computing devices that don't do everything end to end. They are like, they are like a component in the calculation. Now, why does it matter to have that? So when I refer to computational resources, I refer broadly to the hardware, but also implicitly to the sort of class of devices and what they give you to perform computations. Now, why does it matter for supply chain? Because if we take supply chain as a decision-making exercise, and if we proceed with the act of faith that those calculations will be better done with computers, then this is literally the physical layer that will carry those computations. So you see, this act of faith is only a modest one. After all, it's computers are relatively proven to be quite capable nowadays. So, but nonetheless, it starts from this vision that all these decisions, those millions of decisions that a sizable supply chain need to make, will ultimately be done with a computer, one way or another. And thus, if we start thinking about that, then we should start paying a little bit of attention to this hardware layer. And where the situation has become, over the last 4 decades, a lot more complex, is that computers are still progressing, but in ways that are, I would say, a lot more complex and not so intuitive compared to what was happening, I would say, until the end of the 90s.
Okay, well, again, to summarize that, computers are good at decisions, all right, but how does a supply chain practitioner listening to this fit into today's conversation? Like, well, what's the take-home or the top-level view for them?
First, I would say computers are not especially good at decisions. It's just the tool that we have. And it's right now, we don't have any, I would say, viable option to mechanize the decision-making processes. So again, this is kind of an act of faith of why do we want to mechanize? Well, because mechanization has been driving progress for the last 2, maybe even 3 centuries. In the 20th century, it has been the mechanization of essentially blue-collar jobs, and with productivity improvements that were absolutely staggering. It's like 100-fold. And now, in the 21st century, we are seeing the exact same thing, but for white collars. So it's very good, and this is happening thanks to computers. we could think of parallel universe where it would be happening with other things. But for now, the best shot we have is computers. And now the thing is, why does it matter? I would say, why does we have to here? I would treat computational resources and and computing hardware as part of foundational knowledge. You see, when was it the last time that it was useful to you to know where Canada sits on the world map? When was it the last time that it was useful to know that Russia doesn't have any border with Brazil? So that's the sort of things where it is not very clear to you on a day-to-day basis that, for example, having like basic knowledge of the world geography is of any practical use. And yet, if you were to ask the vast majority probably of those people in this audience, you say, what would you think of someone who could not place either, China, Canada, or Russia on the world map? That would sound very strange, and probably you would not maybe trust that many, roles in your organization to those people. So that's you can think of it. It's a little bit of trivia, to some extent it is, yes, but also it is foundational knowledge is the sort of things where if you know really nothing about that, that will create problems. What sort of problems? Well, it depends. It depends very much on the specifics of the situation, specific of the company, specific of the vertical, but you can expect a whole series of problems. And I do believe that computational, I would say, knowledge about computing hardware and computational resources are very much of this class of foundational knowledge that where supply chain practitioners, they should be aware of that. At least they should have quite a mechanical sympathy. That's a term taken from Formula One about those things.
Well, again, I like the analogy that you used, and I'm going to try and use that to tease this point apart, because if you say foundational knowledge is knowing that Brazil and Russia don't share a border, okay, that's one granularity of geographical knowledge, and another is knowing how many capitals South Africa has. These are qualitatively, in my opinion, different layers or different granularities of geographical awareness. So to take that differential and apply it to hardware or computational resources, when you say basic knowledge, are you talking about, well, I know where the USB port is for my mouse, or are you talking about, well, I know how an SSD drive works? Like, what's the order of magnitude of knowledge here?
No, I'm talking more about the abstractions. Again, there is an endless trivia about the computing hardware. It's not about knowing every single devices and knowing the price points and whatnot. I mean, to some extent, if you're a geek, you can enjoy reading about that. I do, but fundamentally, it is more about those very big, very established classes of resources. Again, this is a little bit architecture dependent, but those architecture have been very stable for at least 5 decades. So you can expect that it will continue. So what are we talking of? We are talking of things like memory, volatile memory, persistent storage, bandwidth, arithmetic calculation, that input and output, I/O throughput, latency, all those sort of things have been concerns and have entire classes of concerns, and they have been stable for many decades. So that's what I mean by having this basic knowledge to see a little bit what are the class of concerns, what are the corresponding, it's not necessarily a one-to-one matching, the class of computing hardware, and how does it all fit together to do anything with a modern computer. And that's where, because that's I would say the gist. And if we step back, in terms of layers, you say you ultimately want to have your decision-making processes be computed thanks to this computing hardware. So if you have no knowledge whatsoever about what is happening at the hardware level in these sort of things, it's completely magic. What are the odds that you can even comprehend if a method is a proper fit for the hardware that you have or not? And I'm not talking of, super granular detailed understanding. It's just to have like a super basic understanding of will it even work at all?
Well, for example, because again, you use the phrase. Well, sorry, let me go back one step. You kind of named a few like programming paradigms. I think was from one of your lectures. You talked about programming paradigms, static analysis, array programming, differentiable programming, version control, persistence, all of these concepts. And my question there is, how do those fit together into making the better decisions that you're talking about?
So okay. Again, this is foundational knowledge. So do not expect very specific use case from me, just like, basic geography. When was it the last time that you absolutely needed to know that? Probably never. It is ambient. The problem is that if you have layers of foundational knowledge that are missing, it's just you're bumbling in the dark. You don't even see that you're in the dark. You don't even realize that there is so much that you don't even comprehend. That's really my point. So let's step back. You want to generate those decisions with a computer. That means that you're going to select vendors, probably quite a few. You will buy or rent computing resources, again, from the cloud. You can entirely delegate the thing to your IT, but why would the IT be super good at picking hardware for something they don't know anything about? You see, for example, if I tell you, dear IT, please pick me the best car, unspecified. Okay, fine. So IT say, okay, then I take you a Formula One. Okay, that's our definition of best car. And bam, you say, well, but in fact, I want to drive in dunes along the beach. And then the Formula One turns out to be a completely crappy vehicle because it's absolutely not designed to drive in the sand. So again, if IT, all you tell me is, take me something good, they will take something that is fundamentally good, like again, think of it, the Formula One, a good car. Yes, it is a good car for specific use. Again, we can say, oh, but in fact, a good car is a car where I can park my family of 8, because we are 8 people in this family, or whatever. Again, that's going to be a very different definition of what is good. And you see, we have this illusion that when it comes to, let's say, IT, computing hardware, computing stuff in general, that this is a question of specialists, just like picking a car. I'm not a car specialist, so I will just tell the car department, pick me a good car and deal with it. And then those people, they have so many options of what good even mean that they pick something at random, and then you can complain on the receiving end, oh, but the cost of this Formula One is extravagant. I can't even put a second person in the car. And where I want to drive, which is in the sand, it's not even going to do 10 meters before the wheels will actually not be able to just, have the traction due to the fact that you have so little clearance between the ground and the underhood, the underneath of the car, etc., etc. So you see, if it was a car, people would agree that it would be ludicrous. But then we are talking about, let's say, computer stuff. And then I would say in most companies, people find it completely acceptable to be completely disinterested about the case. Although, again, I go back to the practice, a modern practice of supply chain. A modern practice of supply chain is extremely dependent on those on this computing hardware. Supply chains have been digitalized decades ago, and even companies that think they are kind of low tech, they rely on computers, even if it's just for Excel, enormously. So again, if you on your daily basis you depend on those tools, and again, I would say you do depend on that in a very elaborate way. You see, again, you would say, for example, I depend on the availability of water, but I don't need to know anything about water supply. And that is correct because water as a product is extremely simple. It's chemically simple. And what you expect when you say, tap water, you expect basically 99.99% of literally H2O, and plus a tiny few minerals, plus a little bit of chlorine, for sanitary reason, and that's it. So you see, and the temperature should be something like between 10 and 20 degrees, and that's it. So it is something that is extremely simple. So that's why you don't have the abstraction layer, that is, I get tap water and it's good to drink. I can afford to not know anything about what is upstream. But the problem, and that's where I get to the point of computing resources, is that computing resources, it is many dimensional. It is not something that is simple like water. It is much more like a car. There is so many different types of cars, so many different ways that you could say a good car. If I say what is good water, except if you're doing very, very specific experiments, industrial processing that requires ultra pure water and whatnot, for virtually all the situations that you will encounter in the life, basic tap water is just what you need. So you don't need to know anything about that, because again, you're dealing with a product that is extremely simple. But if you're dealing with a product that is many dimensional, like a car, then you need to know one thing or two about the car if you want to buy that. So again, if we go to supply chain practitioners, well, it turned out that you are extremely dependent on computing resources to do tons of things. Those things will become even more prevalent in the future. What makes you think that you can be completely ignorant of the physical layer of that?
Well, so there's a few points there, one of which is supply chains, obviously, very complex. You're trying to solve many, many things, and that depends on the context. To use your example, maybe you want the car to drive in the desert, you want to drive it on hills, you want to drive it in the city. These are all different contexts. But there are still shared properties in terms of what, at least we think, companies ought to be trying to do with their computational resources. So can you please expand a bit on that?
Yes, I mean, that's here. The thing is that, okay, you want, let's say, to analyze, as a baseline, your transactional history. That would be something. Okay, so that means that this data needs to be stored. So where will it be stored? What sort of hardware? What will be the characteristic of this hardware if you want to store the data and then access the data? Does it have any impact? The answer is yes, it does. Just to give you some very simple idea, is that let's consider that you want to store this data on a spinning disk. It doesn't matter if it's your spinning disk or it's something that you rent on, from a cloud computing platform. If the data is stored on a disk that is spinning, it means that on average, when you want to access a bit of the data, then on average, the disk will have to spin for half a rotation so that you can access the data. That's just because the data can be anywhere in the disk. You want to access a piece of data on average, the disk will have to spin from half a rotation. Okay, fine. What are the consequences of that? Well, the consequence is how fast can the disk spin? Well, a disk will typically spin at something like 7,000 rotations per minute. And if it's like a very fancy drive, it will maybe go till 11,000 or maybe 12,000, but that's it. So rotation per minute. So that means that, in terms of latencies, you should expect that something like 20 milliseconds or something, to access any piece of data. So you would say, well, 20 milliseconds looks short. So, but is it? Because 20 milliseconds, it means that every second you can only access, if you want to jump across your disk, only 50 different pieces of data per second. If you have to jump around, 50 per second is not that much. If you have millions, tens of millions of records to retrieve, you see that very quickly this thing is going to escalate into crazy, crazy delays. Now, you could say, okay, but my disk can store terabytes of data. Yes, but if retrieving the data due to the fact that you have to jump around the disk so much takes days, it is not very, very good. So maybe I can, take many more disks that have smaller capacity, and I will have, more throughput in accessing the data jumping around. Or maybe I can even, use another class of storage entirely and go for SSDs, solid state drive, which provides much, much better latencies for those random accesses. But you see, that's the sort of things where, again, if you have no knowledge whatsoever about computing resources and the classes of computing hardware that provide those resources, those sort of questions would never even occur in your sort of thinking. And can it hurt you? Again, that's the question, is that what you don't know, can it hurt you? I would say yes, because again, you're going to buy a lot of those things, either directly or indirectly. You will buy them directly if your IT department just go and buy cloud computing resources. But you will also buy those things indirectly if you pick a supply chain software vendor. Because you see, if you pick a vendor, you're picking a specific way to consume those computing resources to get the result that you want. And here, my message is that if you think that the average software vendor has any competency on the case, you're completely deluded. The vast majority of, obviously, this is an opinionated take, but I would say the vast, vast majority of my competitors, Lokad's competitors, have, when you look at the management and their interest, generally speaking, they have zero interest for, zero mechanical sympathy for computing hardware. And as a consequence, it should not be too surprising that their software, as a rule of thumb, is horrendously inefficient. And where is that? Well, it goes back to, if you don't pay any attention to your hardware, why would you think that at the end of the day, the software you're going to build on top is going to make a very good use of this hardware? Again, that would be just like picking a Formula One, irrespective of the road you want to drive. And then you wonder why on the beach this is such a crappy vehicle. Surprise, surprise. That's what happens when you don't pay any attention to the computing hardware. So again, if you could trust in a perfect world, you could be trusting, consultants, software vendors, and those people would have made all the right decisions for you. But it turned out that due to the fact that the vast majority of supply chain practitioners are completely ignorant, then software vendors can also afford to be completely ignorant. Why shouldn't they be? After all, if clients can't tell the difference at the time they purchase the software or the solution, doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter until they are hit by the consequence of this ignorance.
Well, okay, so first of all, nothing wrong with having an opinionated take. That's just what we do here. But when you say, ultimately, when companies purchase software from a vendor, I think you said consuming resources to get what they want or to get what you want. Ultimately, and let's be practical here, we're talking about making decisions. So you've given a bit of theory there, but can you be a bit more concrete for people who are curious? How does better computational resource usage, as you're describing, influence or translate to decisions, choices taken in the real world?
So when you have a decisions, you have many ways to craft numerical recipes that will ultimately generate this decision. So that's now the thing is that if the way you consume your computing resources is like fantastically inefficient, and let me give an example. If you start using, let's say, a relational, a transactional database, a SQL database, same thing.
Nothing to do with money.
Has nothing to do with money, indeed. So this is so if you use a transactional database and you want to carry out analytical recipes, so numerical recipes that just do some kind of number crunching, you will pay an overhead tax by probably a factor 100, 2 orders of magnitude, at least, if not 3 orders of magnitudes. And why is that? It's because this layer, software layer, the transactional layer, gives you some very interesting properties, but they have nothing to do with analytical calculation. They give you essentially the four properties known as ACID: atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability. Those things are very nice for transactional processes. They guarantee things like, for example, if you want to declare that a supplier has been paid, you can never end up with a situation where the money has been sent, the order to the bank, but the invoice of the supplier has not been cleared, just because, for example, the computer system just crashed halfway through the operation. So you can end up, you could, in theory, if you didn't have this transactionality, end up with a situation where you have already emitted the wire transfer order, but you did not record the fact that this invoice of a supplier has been settled. So the next time you restart the system, you will issue a second payment and effectively paying the supplier twice. So that's the sort of things that you can get with a transactional layer. It is very, very important for transactional stuff where there is essentially an account that is incremented and another account in the sense of accounting that is decremented, and you want those things to be happening at the same time, logically, so that you never get those things out of sync. Fine, but if you use this sort of I would say, software paradigm to build your analytical resources, you are insanely inefficient. And by the way, surprise, surprise, this is exactly what 99% of my competitors are doing. And what does that mean in terms of decision making? Well, if the way you use computational resources, you start by being like having an overhead of a factor 100, it means that you are restricted to very, very simplistic numerical recipes. Just because as soon you have like a modicum of complexity, you're completely out of budget in terms of compute resources. That means that the prices get like really extravagant super fast. You see, this is not an anecdotal piece of element for if you do not put your computing resources budget under control, you can end up with crazy level of spend. Just to give a price point, many of my, I would say, of my peers, not competitors, peers that would be software as a service company dealing with heavy analytical workload. It's when I look at the S1, so the S1 is a document that you need to publish when you want to go public in the US. So it's very interesting because that's pretty much a report to the investors, to the future investors. And here you can you can look at the decomposition of the spendings. For over the last 3-4 years, most, I would say, software companies that were analytical, like Lokad, not actually supply chain, can be anything, that can be fraud detection, can be processing system logs, whatever. They were typically spending half of their spending were oriented toward cloud computing resources. So that's the effect is the amount of spending is very, very significant. It means despite paying, having on the payroll extremely expensive engineers, an extremely expensive sales force, they still manage to send up half of their spendings toward cloud computing providers. So you see, the idea that the cost of computing resources is like negligible is complete nonsense for most software vendors that are of the analytical class, like Lokad, systems of, not necessarily system of intelligence, but either system of reports or system of intelligence. Those spendings can be very, very significant. And when I say that if you're inefficient, you spend 1 times more, you can see that if you're already spending half of your revenues on computing resources, spending 100 times more, it's just not on the table. It's not even something remotely possible. So that means that in order to stay in budget, what do? Well, you just
Increase the price.
you can increase the price. That's what they do. But even that, you have limits. You can double, maybe quadruple your price, but you can't
10x,
multiply
yeah.
your prices by 100-fold. So what most enterprise software vendors do is just by going for simpler and cheaper recipes, even if they are, I would say, extremely simplistic, and to the point that they do a disservice to their clients. The reality is that they can't afford, as a vendor, something that would be less dysfunctional, because it would be way too costly. And why can't they afford that? Because they are absolutely insanely wasteful with their computing resources.
Well, again, it occurs to me that when you speak and when you explain how you think computational resources, ought to be allocated, it's in pursuit of fundamentally better decisions. That in your mind, that's the problem that ought to be solved. But that's not necessarily the same paradigm that all companies, or rather, not all companies apply that same paradigm. For example, you might be a company that prioritizes something like pursuing service level or pursuing forecast accuracy. And that's the goal. That's the pie in the sky that you're going for. How would computational resource allocation differ in that situation? And feel free to comment.
So, okay, you set a goal for yourself. Here in here, I'm not challenging that part. When I say better decisions, I mean according to whatever metric, whatever goal you set for yourself. You see, so I doesn't matter. I would say if you want better service level, fine. This is your now. You have set a goal for yourself, and now you have processing power at your disposal, computing resources that you can use to get decisions that will be better according to whatever goals you set for yourself. Fine. Now, let's clarify what is the ambient paradigm for like pretty much all my competitors. The ambient paradigm is you will have engineers that will start working on something, and then whenever this something starts is, I would say, compatible with the best hardware that money can buy, they stop working and they start selling the thing to the client. So what does it look like? It means that, okay, I want to do with inventory replenishment for a retail network. So I have, let's say, 20 million SKUs. Fine. First, I tried various things. They don't work. So I fall back to, let's say, safety stock analysis, which is like exceedingly trivial in terms of computing resources. And then, because my system is so inefficient, with extremely expensive computing hardware, I can make it work. And then I stop and I sell that to the client. So first, what was the sort of thinking in this paradigm? Because it was actually, in the software industry, I think the dominant paradigm until the late 90s of 20th century. So, this paradigm was pretty much that computing hardware is progressing exponentially. And so the idea would be you get the best hardware that money can buy, and as soon as it is working, that you have something that is kind of working within those limitations, even if the costs are insane, even if you're not making really a good use of your computing resources, it doesn't matter. Why? Because you have an exponential progression of the computing hardware on all metrics. You see, that was what people refer to as the Moore's law, but in fact there was so many other laws for everything. So all the computing resources were progressing, all the metrics were progressing, and that was very much one of the sort of ideas that made Microsoft extremely successful. Again, in the 90s, the idea is that if it works, it doesn't matter how terrible the performance is, because 5 years from now, the computing hardware will have progressed so much that those computing resources this cost will be trivialized. That was working until the end of the 90s. Since essentially the year 2000, in this area, we have entire classes of metrics that have not improved. For example, the latency latency CPU and memory has pretty much not changed for the last 2 decades. And due to the fact that we are now limited by the speed of light, it's not going to change in the foreseeable future. Another element is, again, the speed of light. Packets over the internet, over long distance, now travels at roughly 2/3 of the speed of light. So there is not that much leeway to improve the speed of packets over the internet because we are already very, very close to the speed of light. We can have more bandwidth, so we can push a lot more packets, no problem. But in terms of raw speed of the packets themselves, we are now very close to the limits of physics, at least physics as we know it. So that's the sort of things where, again, this paradigm, which was very prevalent in the software industry of at the end of the 90s, which was just do something that works and then sell it and then don't worry about performance because it is like a fool's errand. The computing, the industry, the hardware industry will improve everything so much that all those performance concerns will be made irrelevant within just a few years. That was the mindset. And interestingly enough, we still have, I would say, very nice progress from the computing hardware, but the progress has become very subtle. You have like still exponential progressions, but among very specific lines. Not all metrics, some metrics. And the interesting thing is that most of the B2C software industry has been paying a lot of attention to that. For example, the video game industry is paying a huge amount of attention to this sort of details. But when it comes to enterprise software, they are still living, 99% of them, in the late 90s, where they don't pay any attention and they just operate as if 5 years from now, the progress of computing hardware would have made the cost of their system trivial. And it is not the case. And in fact, due to the fact that the amount of data managed by company keeps increasing, we end up in a situation where year after year, the costs that you need to spend to keep your systems running for most software vendors, tend to increase faster than the price is decreasing from the computing hardware. So year after year, you end up spending even more to pretty much keep functionally the same level of quality of your decision-making processes or support for your decision-making processes if it's not completely automated.
Well, hardware progress or computing progress has become subtle, I think was the term used.
Yes,
it's subtle. It's no longer exponential jumps.
It is exponential, but across specific dimensions. In the 90s, the interesting thing is that everything was improving on all fronts. There was not a single metric that would not improve. Nowadays, you have many metrics that have not been moving for literally a decade. If you look at, for example, the amount of heat that you can dissipate from a computer, so your computer needs to get rid of the heat. You can have copper wiring like that. You can have fans. So you can do various things to just extract heat from inside the computer so that those things do not heat. But we have already reached the limit of what is feasible. With air, there is limits that have been reached 2 decades ago. You can use water to make it a little bit performant. If you want to go like super fancy, you can go for liquid nitrogen. It is quite impractical, but it is possible for nice benchmarks, etc. So we have hit the limits. We don't have any magical materials that will let us evacuate, twice as much heat. I mean, we could use maybe diamond. Diamond is a fantastic heat conductor, but the idea of having, kilograms of diamonds to evacuate heat, I mean, it's still, a long way off. And even that will only give us, a modest boost compared to copper, which is already an excellent conductor.
Well, the thing is that actually demonstrates my point a little bit more. So to finish the thought, if the okay, actually, I'll take the example you just gave. So you were talking about the difference between copper wire and diamonds as heat conductors. Okay. To squeeze a little bit more performance out of the heat escaping properties of a computer, that's going to require quite a nuanced and specialized understanding of computer engineering, excuse me. So then to come back to the main topic, how does increasing the your ambient foundational knowledge translate to greater supply chain performance when the margins are as thin as you're describing?
Now, I think, again, that's the sort of thing with foundational knowledge is that it clarifies the picture of everything. Is your IT buying the right sort of stuff, even, directionally? Do you have any idea about that? Can you even discuss the matter with your IT? If you cannot, why should you even expect that what they're buying is remotely making sense? Again, go back to the Formula One, to go on the beach. Doesn't make any sense, but that's exactly the sort of things that happens when people have no knowledge whatsoever of what is at stake. When you want to pick a vendor, can you even have an intelligent discussion about the way they are consuming the computing resources to give you either better decisions or better support for your decisions? Are they consuming those resources in ways that are appropriate with regard to the computing hardware that we have? Does the architecture make sense or absolutely not? Again, if you think in terms of a car, you have so many things that you intuitively know. Aerodynamics, for example. If you were to look at a car that would have, that would be massively violating the laws of aerodynamics, you would think, okay, this thing is going to have such an immense drag in terms of air. The consumption is going to be horrible. No, there is no alternative. So you see, it is the sort of things that, again, just due to the fact that you have foundational knowledge, it is instinctive. You don't necessarily need to be told when you see a car that is like very low, that the aerodynamics are going to be good and that most likely this car can drive faster. That's the thing. You don't have to even think about, okay, what are the fluid dynamics at stakes and whatnot. It is intuitive. And that's the sort of things that if we are looking about, okay, better decisions, can you spot intuitively things that are wholly dysfunctional? And my point is that due to the fact that 99.9% of the clients, so supply chain practitioners, are entirely blind to the question. If there is a philo geeks, around, that you are like a tiny minority. If you are blind, then that means that, again, the response from the ecosystem, the software vendors, the solution vendors, the consultants, is that they don't need to pay attention. Their clients are not paying attention. Why would they? It's if you were living in a country where gasoline is free, why would automaker pay any attention to the consumption of their cars? For them, if gasoline is free, it means that it's mostly an irrelevant concern for the customers, and thus the customers don't pay attention. The vendors of cars don't pay attention. If we go to software vendors, if customers are clueless and don't pay attention, why should enterprise vendor pay attention? And the answer is, well, they don't. And effectively, they do not pay attention. And that's why nowadays, people are always surprised when they look at enterprise software where anything, you click, you want to just see a report, you just want to do something minimal, and it will take seconds for in terms of snappiness. Enterprise software on average is like very, very poor. It is very slow. If you compare, let's say, to web search, so you want to do web search on Google, within something like 50 milliseconds, maybe 100 milliseconds, Google is able to scan the web and give you a digest of stuff that match your query. This is extremely fast and snappy. And conversely, you just want to do something like super basic, like I want to check the state of this SKU, and it takes seconds. Again, and the infuriating part is that it takes seconds on the computing hardware that we have in 2024. It was already taking a second in 20 years ago, despite having hardware that was 100 times less capable. So what happens? Well, what happens was the extra computing hardware has been, the extra capabilities of this hardware has just been wasted through inefficient software.
Again, when you talk, thank you. When you talk about foundational knowledge, it just, and I was listening, as you'll see in a moment, it occurred to me that there's a bit of a, you can split what you're describing there, and I want to get your thoughts on this, because to take an analogy from earlier, you said if you take a car and you go into the desert, okay, is that the best vehicle for the desert? Well, it occurs to me in terms of foundational knowledge, there's both theoretical and practical. So you can have a theoretical foundational understanding of how an internal combustion engine works. Like that's how the car goes. That is a theoretical understanding. There's also a practical foundational knowledge, which is, well, if that tire goes flat, do I have the skills and the basic knowledge to change that tire? If the engine doesn't start, can I do a basic repair? And if you're going to drive in the desert where you'll be alone, you will fundamentally require both a theoretical and at least a basic practical foundational knowledge. So to come back to the topic at hand, you've described in some depth the theoretical foundational knowledge that people should have. In terms of practical foundational knowledge, is there any skills that you think everyone should have in this space?
Yes, again, when you look at the practical would be to have some ideas of the sort of price points we're talking about. You know, what is the cost of a terabyte of storage? What is the cost roughly of a terabyte of memory? What is the cost of a CPU that gives you 2 gigahertz of throughput of computation? You know, again, just having some very, if you can guess a number that is not off by an order of magnitude, that's already very good. You know, it's that's the thing with computer stuff, is that usually if people had to guess, they would their guesses would be off by many orders of magnitude. Again, if I tell you what is the weight of a car and I show you the car, your guess will maybe like be 50% off. You know, you say, okay, 1.5 tons. It turned out that it's an electric car and it's 2 tons plus something. Okay, but that was, you know, you were still within the same order of magnitude. Yeah, yeah. You know, you don't see a car and say it's 20 kilogram or it's 500 tons. But the thing is that when you ask people what is the cost for a terabyte of persistent storage, cheapest that you can find, some people would tell you prices that would range from, I don't know, 10,000 euro to 2 euros and whatnot, and nobody would have any clue about that. I mean, again, maybe IT would have. And same thing if I say to you, what is the cost for a chip that can do, the order of magnitude is 100 billion arithmetic operations per second. What would be a chipset that can do that? What would be the cost? People would say, I don't know, 100,000 euro, or maybe $50. Again, that's the sort of things where I say the practical knowledge is to have some ideas on the price points. Again, that's not precise. If you can have the sort of order of magnitude, you're already in the ballpark of making things that make sense. That's the thing which is very weird with computing resources, is that you have literally 15 orders of magnitude. It is quite. I think it is quite unique. There is no other field that I know of where the order of magnitude are so, I would say, incredibly spread out. 15 orders of magnitude means that we have, on one hand, we are talking to units. You know, one addition, one multiplication, that would be, you know, a unit of computation, and then on the other hand, we are talking of essentially billions of billions. That's really quite a spectrum of orders of magnitude, and that is difficult for the mind to comprehend. And that's why, by the way, when I said that mistakes can be made in terms of wasting computing resources, is that, again, where the analogy of the car is misleading, is that even the worst car is only going to be like 10 times worse in terms of consumption than the best. Let's say, you know, I have like If I want to do 100 kilometers, if I have like a super efficient car, it's going to give me 5 liters of gas to do 100 kilometers. If I go for like a super heavy SUV, inefficient and whatnot, it's going to be, let's say, 50 liters, factor of 10. With computers, it is not like that. It would be like the most efficient thing would be consuming 5 centiliters for 100 kilometers, and the least efficient would be consuming 5 cubic meters for those 100 kilometers. So the orders of magnitude are just wild. And that's where you need to, so again, in terms of practicality, would be to have a few ideas of the price points, also have a few ideas of what is moving and what is not moving.
What do you mean, what is moving and what is not moving?
For example, GPUs
have been
progressing in terms of network trends. GPUs have been progressing like crazy over the last 5 years, and they are still expected to progress like crazy for the next 5. So this is a class of computing resources that is swiftly improving. They are improving in terms of number of operations per second. They are improving also in terms of memory. So that's very, very good. CPUs are on a similar track. They are improving, maybe not as fast, but they're still improving very fast in terms of number of cores and size of L3 memory, which is the memory that lives inside the CPU. It is still improving fast. Correspondingly, if we look at DRAM, DRAM is what is used for the main memory of the computer, volatile memory. So if you shut down your computer, you lose that. That has barely been moving for the last decade. There is very, very few manufacturers. There is like 4 factories in the world. So this is a market where you should not expect, the things to really, I would say, in terms of price drops, you should not expect too much change in the short term, etc. I mean, I would say in terms of practical, it's having some orders of magnitude, knowing a little bit the price point, knowing a little bit what you can expect from, and also just the intuition of will going for, let's say, professional grade hardware give you anything that is very different from consumer grades. Depending on what you're looking at, sometimes the best you can get is something that is just a consumer grade hardware. And the best that you can buy as a company is just marginally better. You see, in some other area, it's not the case. In some other area, what as a company you can buy is many orders of magnitude better than what is typically considered as suitable for the consumer markets. Again, that's the sort of things where having this knowledge really helps you to kind of navigate the landscape, pick the right vendor, or rather eliminate the incompetent one. It's that sort of things that if you start paying attention, you will be able to just filter out the incompetence. Both from consultants, from vendors, and also for in-house projects as well. That matters.
Well, you touched on cost there a number of times, but you spoke mostly in terms of the direct cost of actually physically procuring hardware. In terms of the direct and then indirect cost of not being more savvy with one's computational resources, what are the orders of magnitude we're talking about here? And for that, assume a large retail store, a large retail company, large network, omni-channel, paint whatever picture you want, but what's a reasonable order of magnitude in terms of here's what you stand to lose by not being more savvy with your computational resources?
Well, I would say as a conservative estimate, that over 90% of the supply chain optimization initiatives fail. And quite a big percentage of this 90%, so it's like pretty much all software initiatives fail. And a big percentage of that fail in big part, although it's not the only reason, but in big part due to abysmal performance. Now, when we have to think performance, we have to think of it from, again, different perspective. People would think, okay, I need to do my inventory replenishment every day. So the calculation for everything needs to be able to be done in less than 24 hours. Okay, that's a given. You know, if you want to rerun the computation every day, if you cannot complete the computation in 24 hours, you're kind of screwed. So that's like the upper limit of how much time you can dedicate. Now, you would think that if you buy twice as much computing resources, you can do it twice as fast. Well, not necessarily, because it really depends on the software architecture that you adopt. There are many architecture and design patterns that don't let themselves do such what is called, the technical term is called scale out. So there are many approaches where if you throw more computing hardware at the case, you just do not get a speed up.
It's diminishing returns, essentially.
Yeah, and sometimes no return at all. You can literally throw more resource and you have exactly zero speed up. It really depends on the way you have architecture your software to take advantage of those extra computing resources. Now, let's move forward. Now you have something that can compute your replenishment in, let's say, 4 hours. And you say, great, for your retail network. So it only takes 4 hours. So you have 24 hours in the day. So you will run the computation during the night. Is it satisfying? Well, my answer is no, absolutely not. Why is that? Because here you're just looking at the thing once in production. You don't take into account that your numerical recipe will need to be tuned, and you will need to iterate many times over to converge to the final one that is satisfying. This experimental process is going to be much more costly. So for many reasons. First, when you do your experiments, you don't start by being like very, very cost effective. You will only be cost effective once you've kind of identified something that is, in terms of quality of decision, gives you satisfying results. So it is very normal to expect that when you're just prototyping new recipes, that you will be a lot more efficient, just because the efficiency will come afterwards when you start to really optimize the consumption of computing resources. So that's one thing. But then the other thing is that you have to pay for people to just wait till the calculation is done so that they can look at the results and make the assessment and carry the next iteration. And here, the big problem is if I go back to the software supply chain initiative that fails, is that this process can become dramatically slow. I mean, we were discussing like 4 hours. Let's say, again, that the experiments are going to be twice as slow due to the fact that you're in experimental settings that are not quite as optimized. So that means 8 hours. That means that you can only do one experiment a day. That means that if you need to do 500 iterations, this thing is just going to take 2 years. And it's going to be so slow that you're going to start have other problems, such as the people doing the experiments, they will start to rotate from and to another job. You know, the engineers you're working with are not with you for 40 years. So at some point, you will have people that have started to work on the project and then they quit, and you have to bring new people, and they don't necessarily remember all the experiments that have been done. So so you see, this is sort of problems that creates so many problems. Also, even if you do converge to a satisfying numerical recipe, you're just one disruption away, lockdowns or whatever, and you need to re-engineer the recipe. Again, if your iterative process is like incredibly sluggish, you will systematically fail to cope with all the disruption. By the time you have finally engineered a solution for the disruption, you already moved on to something else. So you need to have something that is extremely performant so that your iterations are very swift. And that gives also another twist, which is that the performance when you go from one iteration to the next, you can cheat, because maybe from one experiment to the next, you're going to redo most of the very same calculation. So do you need to re-spend all those resources if in fact you're just doing almost the exact same numerical recipe with a tiny few divergence? Maybe if you have like a smart approach, you would recycle most of what you've already computed so that you can iterate much faster without redoing everything every single time. But that's again, that will only work if you can sort of understand where are my computing resources going, what am I wasting, what I am doing twice or 10 times in a row, and I should only be doing that only once.
Okay, well, Joannes, people listening today, and I'm sure they're all saying, I agree with this man. I trust him. He's trustworthy. What are the next immediate steps for, let's say, the average supply chain practitioner and C-level people who are listening to you and think, okay, I want to be more savvy about these things?
I would say start reading introduction materials about how computer works. There are plenty of books that will tell you how computer works, and start trying to get some understanding, for example, of what is being sold by cloud computing providers. Again, you can look it up. All the prices are public, so you can go to Microsoft Azure and see, okay, what is the price point for storage, for CPUs, for virtual machines, for bandwidth and whatnot. Again, that's a few hours. You can have, I would say, elementary books. I mean, there is even books that are intended for, high school or middle school, and it's okay. It's the idea of trying to get this knowledge, and then whenever the topic arises of a technological evolution, ask the vendor, ask the consultant, okay, what is your take on computational resources? We want to have the very best decisions according to whatever metric and goals you set for yourself. Engage the discussion on how is those raw resources that I'm buying on one hand, how does it translate into the very best decisions? If the people you're about to buy a lot of stuff from have no clue about that, then you should run away. That's my takeaway, is that use that as a litmus test to detect so-called experts that should not even be experts in the first place, that are absolutely, I would say, incompetent. Because ultimately, if you go with those sort of vendors, you will end up paying, I would say, the price of their inefficiencies. And the price will be twofold. It will be, one, you will pay a lot more for computing hardware, to the point that it's extravagant. As a rule of thumb, Lokad is typically, when we sell a subscription, we are way below the cost of our competitors just for the computing resources, not even taking into account the manpower, the engineering manpower to set up and maintain. So just Lokad tends to be below the hardware cost. So that's one point. But then you will have something that is even bigger, which is your vendor will corner you into super simplistic recipe, trying to convince you that it's the best that science has to offer and whatnot, while in fact it is just a reflection of their inability to properly leverage the computing resources. That's why you end up with uber simplistic things like safety stocks that are still prevalent. I mean, vendors deep down, they know it's complete crap. But the problem is that they are so inefficient with their use of computing resources that for them it would be wholly impractical to even consider things that would be better. So you see, twofold of cost: direct cost, which is extravagant spending on computing resources that don't make any sense. And then you have the second order of cost, which is you are cornered into simplistic recipes where ultimately you will be forced as a practitioner to step in with your spreadsheets to manually fix all the insanity that comes out of those systems. Why? Because the system is using overly simplistic recipes that pretty much delegate all the subtleties to you, because the recipe is simplistic and do not deal with any kind of sophistication.
There was an analogy, or not an analogy, an actual rule of thumb you used earlier, or question, excuse me, you said, if you don't know how much does a terabyte of cloud computing cost or something like that, if you don't even have the order of magnitude, that's basically a problem. And it's interesting when you say that, because most people in their personal lives, even people listening, if they walked into a cafe to order a coffee and they were told, all right, that's 45 euros,
Yes.
they would balk. They would be shocked and be like, okay, well that's not right. I don't know how much you personally should be charging me, but 45 euros is a bit steep.
Yes.
And they would presumably leave and go somewhere else. Now, even if it's in a touristic area, you'd still say 45 euros. No, that's incorrect. But nothing ultimately hinges on that. I mean, you're not going to ruin yourself, presumably not ruin yourself financially. You're not going to lose your job because of that. However, the same sort of instinct, survival instinct, or like just overall savviness might be entirely absent when it comes to, okay, I have to make very expensive decisions over what kind of computational resources or software the company is going to use, the direct and indirect long-term costs of that, the short-term indirect and long-term costs of that. Have no idea. Like, oh, it costs 55,000 euros per second of computing, whatever. Again, that actually might be right. I don't know. Probably not. But the point being, if you can't answer those questions, I would agree there's an enormous hole in your own professional knowledge that you should seek to fill.
Yes, again, it is maybe a little bit demanding, for supply chain practitioners, but what is at stake is big lines of budgets. I mean, large companies are willingly spending millions and sometimes tens of millions of euros or dollars a year on those systems. And I'm always completely baffled when you can spend that much and have and nobody, vendor included, has any idea about those basic problems. Again, that would be like buying a building, because that's something very expensive. So it's like buying a building and you have an architect that has no clue what concrete actually is. You'd say, you know what? I'm not sure. Maybe the building is made out of cardboard or concrete or maybe wood or maybe marshmallows. I don't care. Just put paint on it and it all looks the same, That's the sort, again, I think computer stuff and software, the software industry is very special in this regard, that there is tons of money involved. And there is this implicit agreement that having everybody completely ignorant about that is just fine. And it is, for me, it is very intriguing as an industry. And I've been talking with most of my competitors, and when I say my competitors, I mean management teams. And I'm always baffled when nobody has any clue about this sort of, any of those mechanical sympathy where you have some basic understanding of what goes into that. And again, that could be like, think of it as a Formula One driver that say, you know what, I have four wheels. What is happening between the pedal and the wheels, it's magic. There's stuff. It does make a loud noise. I know it's loud, but other than that, there is just stuff. It's my vision of the car is stuff. That's the level of granularity. That would be, people would think this is insane. You should know a lot more if you expect to make a good use of the car. And my way, I think supply chain practitioners are using tons of digital tools every day, just like a Formula One driver is using a Formula One. And so they need to understand a little bit, to have this mechanical sympathy of what is going on, how does this stuff is working, so that they can have informed decision. At least so that people don't sell them stuff that is completely nonsensical and thus they end up failing for reasons that are entirely preventable.
Well, Joannes, I could not have put it better myself. Thank you. And thank you very much for your time. I don't have any more questions. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.